Section 7, Overview of Real Estate Valuations. An appraisal is an opinion of value. The purpose of an appraisal is to determine the problem to be solved and the type of value to be estimated. Real estate licensees may perform appraisals for compensation. They may not represent themselves as certified or licensed appraisers, and they must conform to the USPAP standards. They may not prepare appraisals that are required for a state, certified, or licensed appraiser. There are two appraiser boards. You have the qualification boards and the standards board. Qualifications board establishes qualification for state certified licensed appraisers, appraiser education, and appraiser experience. The appraisal standard boards sets forth rules for developing an appraisal and reporting its results, promoting the use, understanding, and enforcement of the USPAP. You have the registered trainee appraiser, the licensed appraiser, the certified residential appraiser, and the certified general appraiser. Types of value: assessed value, going concern value, insurable value, investment value, liquidation value, salvage value, and value in use. When determining market value, it is assumed that the buyer and seller are typically motivated. Both parties are well informed or well advised, acting in their own best interest, and that a reasonable time is allowed in the open market. The payment will be made in cash, US dollars, or comparable financial arrangements, and that price is not affected by special financing or seller concessions. Principle of value: supply and demand. Demand is the desire and ability to purchase or rent goods and services. Variables that influence demand are price of real estate, population number and household composition, income of consumer, availability of mortgage credit, and consumer taste or preferences. The probable and legal use of real property that is physically possible, defendable, financially feasible, results in highest and best value. There are two types: highest and best used as though vacant, and highest and best used as improved. Highest and best used as improved compares alternative uses, total acquisition cost, net operating incomes divided by total cost gives a rate of return for each use. Use with the highest rate of return is the highest and best use as improved. Identifying the problem to be solved starts with identifying the client. Anonymous clients must document identity of the client in the work file, but omit the client's identity on the appraisal report. The report must state the client's identity is withheld at the client's request. Identify the intended users by name or type as users of the appraisal. Identify the intended use of the appraisal to determine the appropriate scope of work. Now, about developing the appraisal according to the scope of work. It needs to include sufficient information to allow intended users to understand the scope of work performed. Identify the client and other intended users. Identify the intended use of opinions and conclusions. Type and definition of value. Effective date of the appraisal. Identify the subject property and relevant characteristics, and extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions. Types of appraisal reports. Appraisals are either oral or written. Written report options. An appraisal report. Restricted appraisal reports may be provided when the intended user is exclusively the client. And appraisal report formats. You have the form report and the narrative report. The purpose of an appraisal, the appraiser must identify the client, the intended use of the appraisal, and the intended user. The standards of practice include the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, known as USPAP, federally related transactions, real estate related financial transaction which involves a federal financial regulatory agency, Office of Thrift Supervision, Office of Comptroller of Currency, the Fed, FDIC, or the National Credit Union Administration, requires an appraisal for transaction values that exceed $250,000. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, HUD, and VA require appraisals be completed by state-certified or licensed appraisers regardless of transaction value. Price, cost, and value. Price is the amount paid, the contract price. Cost is the expenditure to create an improvement, the labor, material, and land. And the value is the ability to command goods and services in exchange. Basically what they're saying there is how much you can sell it for. Market value is defined as the consensus of the interactions of many buyers and sellers in a particular market. And there are three broad categories: relationship, knowledge, and motivation of the buyer and seller, terms of the sale, cash, cash equivalent, or other terms, and the conditions of the sale, exposure in a competitive market for a reasonable amount of time. The principles of value. Speaking of supply and demand, supply is the amount and type of real estate available for sell or rent at different price levels in a given market. Variables that influence supply are availability of skilled labor, construction loans and financing, land, and materials. Principles of value include anticipation, substitution, which is sales comparison approach, cost approach, income approach, increasing and decreasing returns, for example, over improvement, conformity, and external economies and diseconomies. The highest and best uses, though vacant, is the legal use that brings the greatest value. If vacant, what type of structure should be erected? The appraiser compares the alternative uses. Net operating incomes and capitalization rates to derive the total value, minus the development cost. And the one with the highest residual land value is highest and best uses, though vacant. The appraisal process. Identify the problem to be solved, including identifying the client, intended users, and the use of the appraisal. Second, determine the scope of work necessary to develop a credible appraisal. And third, develop an appraisal according to the scope of work. Determine the scope of work. The type and extent of research and analysis, including extent to which the property is identified, extent to which tangible property is inspected, type and extent of data researched, type and extent of analysis applied to arrive at opinions or conclusions. Developing the appraisal according to the scope of work, land use regulations, economic supply and demand, and market trends. Opinion of the highest and best use. Collect, verify, and analyze information. Type of value estimated. Reconcile the approaches and report the appraisal.